The wind whispered through the skeletal remains of what had once been the bustling town of Everfield. Rusted signs creaked in rhythm with the gentle breeze, and old storefronts stood frozen in time, shadows of a life that once thrived. The sun cast long, golden rays over the cracked asphalt, but the warmth did little to chase away the dread that hung heavy in the air. From atop the old water tower, 28-year-old Maren Cole surveyed the hushed ruins below. Her eyes, a sharp gray, scanned every alley and collapsed building for the telltale signs of movement. It had been 3 days since she'd seen another living person, and 2 since she'd heard the low, guttural moans of the undead. She adjusted the rifle slung over her back and muttered, "Too quiet." It hadn't always been this way. A year ago, Everfield had been home to family barbecues, open-air markets, and the steady hum of life. But then came the Veil, the mysterious airborne pathogen that brought the dead back hungry, mindless, and relentless. Maren's breath caught as she spotted a flicker of movement near the gas station. She slipped behind the rusted railing, heart pounding. From the distance, a figure limped into view. Human? No, the gate was off. Stiff. The figure paused, then let out a ragged exhale that wasn't quite human. A confirmed. She watched carefully. It was alone, a rare sight these days. Most of them traveled in packs, driven by some grotesque instinct to herd together. Still, one could mean more. Always more. Carefully descending the tower's interior ladder, Maren landed silently on the gravel below. She ducked into the alley behind Max Hardware, where a makeshift hideout awaited, barricaded with metal shelving and salvaged doors. Inside, she checked her supplies: 3 cans of soup, 2 bottles of water, half a box of rifle rounds, and a radio with fading batteries. She needed to move soon, or risk getting cornered when night fell. As she packed, static crackled from the radio, louder than before. To anyone still alive, repeat, survivors en route to Fort Lineage, coordinates to follow, safe zone confirmed, armed forces active. Maren froze. Fort Lineage. That was nearly 80 miles east, past riverbeds, burned-out suburbs, and known containment zones. No man's land. But if it was true, if people were still organizing, if the military was regrouping, there might be hope. She scribbled the coordinates on a torn map, heart racing. She needed a vehicle. Just as she turned to leave, a loud crash echoed through the alleyway. Her body tensed. That sound had been too close. She inched toward the barricade and peeked through a gap in the boards. A young man, barely more than a teen, was scrambling over the wall behind the laundromat, clutching a metal pipe. Behind him, a chorus of snarls. Confirms. At least 6. No, 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 Maren hissed under her breath. The boy stumbled, falling hard onto the ground just yards from her shelter. Blood smeared across his brow. The horde closed in. Without thinking, Maren flung open her barricade and shouted, "Hey!" The moaning stopped. All heads turned. "Run! This way," she yelled, raising her rifle. The boy barely managed to get to his feet. She fired once, then again. The shots echoed like thunder. 2 confirms dropped, but the rest didn't hesitate. The boy dove past her into the shelter. Maren slammed the door shut and braced it with her shoulder. The undead began slamming into the barricade seconds later, their nails clawing through the gaps. "Who are you?" the boy gasped. "Maren," she panted. "And congratulations, you just brought hell to my front door." The radio squawked again. "Repeat, Fort Lineage, safe zone, coordinates." Outside, the pounding grew louder. But inside, 2 survivors stared at each other with a single shared thought. Survive the night. Then move. The night was thick with silence as Maren and the boy, whose name turned out to be Sam, pressed themselves into the farthest corner of the makeshift hideout. The small space, once a storage room, now served as their only protection from the world outside. The pounding on the barricade had finally stopped, but neither of them dared to relax. The undead outside were relentless, and they both knew it was only a matter of time before the barricade gave way. Sam's breathing was shallow, his face pale in the dim light of their small flashlight. His eyes darted around nervously, scanning the room for anything that might give him comfort. Marin, on the other hand, was focused. Her mind raced through options, considering escape routes, weapons, and the quickest way out of Everfield. They couldn't stay here. They had to leave before more of the undead found their way to the alley. "Can you move?" she asked softly, keeping her voice low. Sam nodded, but he didn't speak. He was shaking, whether from fear, exhaustion, or the blood loss from his earlier fall, Marin couldn't tell. His head was wrapped in a crude bandage she'd managed to make with some torn cloth, but he still looked like he'd barely survived the encounter with the undead. "Good. We're heading east," she continued, her voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at her gut. "Fort Lineage. It's not far, and if the broadcast is true, we'll be safe there." Sam blinked. "Safe? You've seen how these things move. They're everywhere. How can there be a safe zone?" Marin stood, her gaze fixed on the barricade, listening for the faintest sound. "You heard the radio. The military's regrouping, Sam. They're trying to take control of this mess. If we get to them, we stand a better chance." "Better than what?" Sam shot back, his voice trembling with frustration. "Better than just dying out here like everyone else?" Marin exhaled sharply, leaning against the wall. She understood his fear, his hopelessness. But she couldn't afford to let herself fall into that same mindset. Not now. Not when there was a chance, no matter how slim, that they could make it out alive. "Better than wandering around until we're eaten alive," she said quietly. There was a long pause, the tension thick in the air. Sam didn't argue, but he didn't seem convinced either. He wiped his brow, the fatigue evident in his face. They'd been on the move for hours, and the distance they still had to cover weighed heavily on both of them. Marin checked her supplies again, her rifle, her few remaining rounds, the map, and the water. They had to be smart. Moving through the streets of Everfield would be too dangerous. Too many abandoned vehicles could be hiding bodies, too many corners where the undead might be lurking. But the open road, if they could get to it, would be their best chance. "All right," she said, turning to Sam. "We move out at first light. We're sticking to the alleys and rooftops. Stay close to me." Sam nodded, though the fear was still evident in his eyes. She didn't blame him. Fear had been her constant companion for the past year. But it was also the thing that kept her alive. The hours passed in silence, each one stretching longer than the last. Marin stayed alert, her senses sharpened by the years of surviving in this hellish world. The wind howled outside, pushing against the old building, but the silence was still unnerving. No moans, no shuffling feet. The night seemed too calm, as if the undead were waiting, watching. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, Marin was already on her feet. She motioned for Sam to follow as she carefully eased open the barricade. The street was empty, eerily so, and the only sound was the faint rustling of wind through the decaying town. "Stay close," she whispered to Sam, her voice barely audible over the stillness. "And keep quiet." They slipped into the alley, moving as swiftly and silently as they could. The concrete underfoot felt cold and unforgiving, but they pushed forward. Each step was measured, calculated. They didn't know how long they had before the undead would begin to stir again. They didn't know if the safe zone was even real. But they had to try. As they rounded a corner, Marin froze. Her breath hitched as she caught sight of a figure standing at the end of the alley, just a shadow at first, but as it moved into the light, Marin's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't one of the undead. But it wasn't exactly human, either. The man was tall, wearing a patchwork of armor made from scavenged materials. His face was hidden behind a bandana, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Marin's. "We don't get many visitors," the man said, his voice low but firm. "You lost her looking for something?" Marin's grip tightened on her rifle, but she didn't raise it. "Not yet. Looking for a way out," she said, keeping her tone even. "Fort Lineage. The man's eyes narrowed. You're a long way from there. You'd be better off staying put. We're not staying here, Marin replied, stepping forward. You know the way? The man paused, studying them both for a moment. Then, with a small nod, he grunted. Follow me. But keep quiet, and stay close. You don't want to get caught out here when they start waking up. Marin exchanged a glance with Sam. The boy looked as uncertain as she felt, but he nodded in agreement. With no other option, they followed the stranger into the shadowed streets of Everfield. The stranger led them through the twisted streets of Everfield without a word, his movements calculated and deliberate. Marin couldn't shake the sense of unease that lingered in the air. There was something about him, something off. He moved like someone who knew this world intimately, but his calm demeanor, the way he seemed to anticipate every shadow and noise, unsettled her. Sam, too, was watching the stranger warily, his face pale and drawn. Marin couldn't blame him. Trust was a rare commodity these days, and they both knew better than to blindly follow anyone. But the man had proven useful so far, leading them through the streets with expert precision, avoiding the undead as if he could sense their presence before they did. They turned down a narrow alley, its entrance hidden by a collapsed brick wall. As they moved deeper into the shadows, the stench of decay grew stronger. Marin's stomach churned, but she kept her focus. There was no time to dwell on the dead. Not now. You're not telling us everything, Marin said quietly, her voice just above a whisper. The stranger glanced over his shoulder, a brief flicker of amusement in his eyes. You're not the first to think that. What makes you think I'm hiding something? Gut feeling, she replied. And the fact that you don't seem at all concerned about getting swarmed by the undead. Most people don't act that calm when they're being hunted. He chuckled softly, the sound barely audible over the distant groans of the undead. You've got a sharp eye. But you're right about one thing, I know this town. And I know how to avoid the dead. They're predictable, if you know what to look for. And you should, too, if you want to survive. Marin's hand tightened around the rifle slung over her shoulder. And you think we're ready for that? The stranger didn't answer immediately. He led them past a row of abandoned homes, their windows shattered, doors hanging off their hinges. They moved quickly, but cautiously, avoiding the open streets where danger could come from any direction. Finally, he spoke again. You're going to have to be. If you want to reach Fort Lineage, you'll need more than just luck. You'll need to learn how to move like a shadow, like you don't even exist. Sam glanced nervously between the stranger and Marin. What do you mean, move like a shadow? The man's voice dropped to a near whisper. You'll see. If you're smart, you'll stay in the dark. If you're lucky, you'll get through it alive. They turned a corner and came upon a hidden door in the side of an old church. The stranger pushed it open without hesitation, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into the darkness below. The air was cool, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something else, something metallic. Marin didn't like it. I've got a safe house down here, the stranger said, stepping aside to let them enter. Rest up. You'll need all your energy for what comes next. Marin hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the darkness, rifle at the ready. Sam followed close behind her, his steps hesitant, but driven by the desire to find safety, any semblance of safety, in a world that had lost all sense of it. The safe house was a small, underground bunker. A few rickety chairs, crates filled with supplies, and a single table cluttered with maps and radios filled the space. Marin scanned the room quickly, her military instincts kicking in. Nothing looked immediately dangerous, but the low hum of a generator nearby and the lack of windows made her uneasy. The stranger closed the door behind them, locking it with a rusty bolt. He walked to the table and motioned for them to sit. It's not much, but it'll do for now. Sam lowered himself onto one of the chairs, still clutching the metal pipe he'd used as a weapon. He looked exhausted, his eyes heavy with the weight of the journey so far. Marin could see the weariness on his face, the toll this nightmare had taken on him. She didn't sit down right away. Instead, she moved toward the map spread out on the table. She studied the route to Fort Lineage, tracing her finger along the roads and waterways that lay ahead. The journey would be grueling. There were stretches of forest, desolate towns, and the treacherous stretch of land known as the Culling Grounds, a place infamous for being overrun by undead hordes. "We'll need a vehicle," Marin said, her voice steady despite the looming dread. "To make it to Fort Lineage in any reasonable amount of time, we'll need to avoid the major roads. We'll have to cut through the backcountry. There's a garage not far from here, by the old high school. It might have something we can use." The stranger watched her, silent for a moment. Then, his lips curled into a half-smile. "You're thinking about making a run for it, huh?" Marin nodded. "If we want to get out of this alive, we need to move fast. Every minute we waste here, more of them show up. We don't have time to sit and wait." The stranger's smile faded, and he glanced toward the stairs, listening for any sounds from above. Then, he turned back to them, his expression hardening. "All right," he said, his voice cold. "But you should know something. You're not the only ones looking for a way out." Marin's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "There are others," he said slowly, his gaze narrowing. "Others who've made it this far. Some of them are friendly. Some of them aren't. And they'll do whatever it takes to get to Fort Lineage. Even if it means dragging you down with them." Sam's eyes widened, and Marin felt a chill creep down her spine. "Let's just hope we're faster than they are," Marin said, her voice grim. The road ahead was dangerous, maybe even more dangerous than the undead themselves. But they had no choice. The air in the underground bunker was thick with tension. Marin stood by the door, staring into the dim light of the room, her mind racing through every possible scenario. They had no time to waste. The military broadcast about Fort Lineage had been their only glimmer of hope, but now, with the stranger's warning echoing in her mind, every step toward their goal felt like a gamble. Would they make it out alive, or would the road ahead be their last? Sam shifted uneasily in his chair, still clutching the pipe like it was the only thing keeping him grounded in a world that no longer made sense. His once bright eyes now appeared hollow, the weight of survival wearing him down more with every passing day. "Do you think he's telling the truth?" Sam asked, his voice a whisper, though no one else was in earshot. Marin didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced back at the stranger, who had moved to a corner of the room and was quietly packing a small bag with essentials. A dark sense of suspicion gnawed at her insides, but the stranger's behavior hadn't suggested anything malicious, at least, not yet. "I don't know," Marin said finally, her voice low. "But right now, we don't have any better options. We take the chance." The stranger glanced up from his bag, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "You're a smart one. Most people would have given up by now, but you're still pushing forward. That's good. It means you've got the right mindset for this world." Marin's gaze hardened. "I'm not here to make friends, and I'm not here to be your test subject. I just want to survive. If you're leading us into a trap, now's the time to say it." The stranger shrugged. "I'm not leading you anywhere. I'm just helping you get to the crossroads. After that, you're on your own." "The crossroads?" Sam repeated, looking up with a mix of confusion and wariness. The stranger nodded, his face unreadable. "Yeah. It's where the roads split. You'll know it when you get there. But be careful. Some people use that place as a meeting point, and not all of them are friendly." Marin's pulse quickened. "What kind of people?" The stranger looked at them both for a moment, his lips tight. "The kind you don't want to meet." There was no further explanation. The implication was clear, they were about to step into a much larger and more dangerous world than they had anticipated. The crossroads could be their final destination if they weren't careful. Marin wasn't one to be intimidated easily, but the reality of what lay ahead pressed on her like a physical weight. Every instinct screamed that they needed to move, now. If they stayed too long, even in a safe house like this, the undead would find them. It was only a matter of time before they were trapped here, too vulnerable to escape. "All right," Marin said after a moment. "Let's go." We'll take the back streets to the old garage. If there's a car, we use it. If there isn't, we'll figure something else out. Sam stood, and for the first time, his gaze met hers without fear, just determination. Let's get out of here. The journey through Everfield's crumbling streets felt even more oppressive in the daylight. The once bustling town, now desolate, stood as a grim reminder of how quickly the world had turned to ruin. Buildings that had been filled with life were now nothing but hollow shells, broken windows staring out like empty eyes. They moved quickly and silently, keeping to the shadows, staying low. The stranger led the way, his movements so fluid that he seemed to melt into the landscape, blending with the world like part of the wreckage. Marin and Sam followed, doing their best to stay in his wake and keep a low profile. Every now and then, Marin would glance over her shoulder, her instincts telling her that something was wrong, that they weren't as alone as they should have been. As they approached the high school, the garage came into view, a large, rusted structure that had once held the promise of convenience and shelter. Now, it stood as a relic of a time long gone. The door was partially open, the metal creaking with each gust of wind. Marin motioned for them to stop, holding her breath as she listened intently for any signs of movement inside. The wind rustled, and the distant groans of the undead echoed through the streets, but there was no immediate sound from the garage. "Stay here," the stranger whispered, stepping forward. "I'll check it out." He disappeared into the shadows of the garage without a sound. Marin and Sam stood in place, barely daring to breathe. Marin's mind raced, the silence stretching out longer than she was comfortable with. It was like waiting for a storm to break. Then, there was a muffled sound from the garage, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They weren't the slow, shuffling steps of the undead. These were fast, purposeful. Marin's heart skipped a beat. "We've got company." Before she could react, the stranger emerged from the garage, his face set in a grim expression. He gestured for them to follow. "Move now," he barked. They sprinted toward the door, and just as they ducked inside, the sound of shuffling footsteps erupted from the street behind them. The undead were close, too close. The garage smelled of oil and rust, but it offered them shelter, and it held a promise of escape. A beat-up van sat in the far corner, its tires flat but its engine still intact. Marin rushed over to it, tearing open the door. "Get in," she shouted to Sam. The stranger climbed into the driver's seat without hesitation, and Marin slammed the passenger door shut. Sam clambered into the back, eyes wide with fear, his breath coming in quick gasps. The van roared to life, the engine sputtering as the stranger floored the gas pedal, sending them barreling down the cracked, deserted streets. But the undead were already closing in. As they turned the corner, the first wave of monsters appeared, stumbling into the street in pursuit. The tires screeched, and Marin's heart pounded as they tore through the remnants of Everfield, heading toward the unknown, toward Fort Lineage. It wasn't safe yet. But it was a start. And sometimes, that's all you could hope for. And thanks for letting me bring this story to life. If you want to expand or explore different directions, just let me know.